Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And this week we're going to take a look at the Third Reich in power, where we continue from last week, where we took a look at the rise of the Third Reich. And this week we are going to take a look at the Third Reich from 1933 to 1939. And we are once again joined by Anders. Let me try to get that name right. Anders Kjøstvedt. It's kind of weird to say Norwegian's name in English. I'm not gonna lie, so I hope I got it right again. And yeah, before we begin with the Third Reich in power, let's do a brief recap of the end of let's say from 1930 to 1933, just to get the feeling of how Hitler came into power as a chancellor for Germany in 1933.
Yes, we talked about in the previous episode of the hectic year of 1932 when there are several elections. And we talked about the decline of the Nazi movement in specifically the late autumn of 1933, of 1932, going into the winter and turn of the year 1932 and 33. And that this is a very important background to understand why the Nazi movement was helped into power. They had tried to gain power both through violent means in 1923 to overthrow the German government that failed spectacularly, but also using the democratic system through elections was not successful either for the German Nazi Party. They never achieved the majority vote that they sought to achieve in order to actually gain political power. So they were, in the end, dependent on supporters, or at least people that had access to the political power that wanted to achieve at least something of the same that the Nazis did. So the traditional elites from the political, economical, and also the military fields in Germany were those that actually helped Hitler and the Nazis into power in January 1933.
Hmm. So let's talk about the forming of the new government that would become Nazi Germany, because of course some essential characters would be Goering and of course Goebbels have been briefly mentioned in last week's episodes. And let's talk about some of the, and of course Himmler would be as well a key player in the new government. So let's talk about forming the new German Nazi government that would lead all the way until 1945.
Yes. One thing that's important to point out here is that it's only to a limited degree a Nazi government. The
Mm.
first cabinet that is established in January 1933, there are only three Nazis in it. And it is a coalition government where the Nazi politicians are in a significant minority. It's only, in addition to Hitler himself, who is the Reich Chancellor, there are Frick, who is the Interior Minister, so that he controls the police. And there's also Hermann Göring, who is a minister without portfolio, as they say. He doesn't have a he doesn't have a ministry to run, but he's still part of the government, and he also holds significant power within the state of Prussia, which is significant as this is the largest federal state in Germany. And the rest of the government is constituted by the conservative elites that help the Nazis into the positions of power. Most chiefly among them is Franz von Papen, who is a German nationalist, previously member of the Zentrum Party, the Catholic Party, and he's then the vice chancellor. And it's his idea to stock the government with people that he works with in order to control the Nazis and in order to control Hitler so that he cannot use his position of power to change German politics too much. And it is this calculation, you could say, that actually failed quite spectacularly. But there
Mm.
is reason to argue that the first Hitler cabinet, the first Hitler government, is also marked by continuity because there's not that large of a step from the previous governments. into the first Hitler government. But there are drastic changes that take place during the spring of 1933.
Hmm. Now, what's interesting that I kind of noticed, and I can't help but do comparison here, because what Hitler does when he gets to power is that he actually, even though the SA was kind of essential to get him in power, he kind of almost immediately started to take distance from the SA. And again, here comes the comparison. And sorry for anyone who may be, or I'm not sorry, but I can't help but do the comparison here because he kind of saw the same thing with when Donald Trump came into power last year. He kind of moved away from the MAGA movement as well. We kind of see the similarity here that, because even though they were essential to getting both of these, both the SA and the Nazis were essential about getting, you know, the Nazis in helping Hitler to power and the MAGA movement to get Trump in power. We see that when both Hitler and Trump got in power, they both kind of shied away and moved away from these political powers that they try not to be associated with this.
Yes, it's true that the SA, the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party, you could say, the brown shirts, they are instrumental in bringing the Nazis into a position of power in 1933. They are a radical movement that helps gain the Nazis a lot of activism and presence, you could say, in the public space. Hitler does distance himself from the SA, but that takes some time. That doesn't happen until the summer of 1934. And in these crucial weeks and months of the first Hitler government, the SA is very, very important because it is used as a political weapon and as a violent arm of the Nazi movement and used to persecute and imprison, torture, also murder political opponents, mostly from the communist movement, at least in the earliest weeks, following the Reichstag fire in
Yeah.
late February 1933, but also then moving on to more social democratic and other political opponents of the new Nazi government. So the step away from, you could say, the most radical and activists elements of the SA, that is an important step in the establishment of Nazi Germany, but that comes later. In
Right.
the earliest months, the SA is a very important tool in order to suppress any kind of political opposition. And it is used as a more like a quasi police in order and is given the opportunity to also take arrests of political opponents and place them in irregular prisons and what then emerges as concentration camps.
You mentioned the Reichstag fire. That was actually the next topic I wanted to talk about. So let's talk about the essential Reichstag fire. And there is of course theories that the Nazis were behind this. Has this been, and I don't remember if this has been confirmed or not, but what this I don't remember the name of the guy. He was a communist, the guy who were and seemingly to be acted alone to set the fire to Russia, but this would be kind of the green light to arrest and make, and it was kind of a, but not in bad luck for Hitler in a way to put it that way. It's bad luck in luck. I don't remember how the saying goes, but it was the green light to make a one-party state out of Germany and to ban all of the political opponents. And let's talk about the importance of the Reichstag fire in February 1933.
Yeah, the fire itself is very important, or at least how the new government or the Nazi elements of the new government actually take uses the fire in order to further their political ambitions. There's been a huge debate of what actually happened on the 27th of February 1933. What we know is that the Reichstag actually caught fire. There was a fire, and it was the building was not completely destroyed, but it was unusable for several years following.
Mm.
There has been a theory that the Nazis themselves were parts of the fire, that they actually planted the arsonist there, Marinus van der Lubbe, as a German, no, not a German, a Dutch young man. He was previously a member of the communist youth in the Netherlands, but he had very few ties to the communist movement at this moment in time. But he had traveled to Germany in order to try to make some kind of spectacular event as a demonstration against the new German government. It is quite certain today that Marinus van der Lubbe actually set fire to the Reichstag, and it is agreement among historians today that this he acted alone, that the Nazi did not take part in this. I think one of the reasons that this theory has emerged is that it was extremely convenient for Hitler and the new government that the Reichstag actually caught fire or was set on fire, and that it was done by a person that was at least partial to the communist movement. Because then they could style this fire as the beginning of a communist uprising in Germany. And as we talked about in the previous episode, anti-communism and the fear of communist uprisings, communist revolutions in Germany was an important part of why certain elements of the German society actually supported Nazism. And in these weeks after the establishment of the first Hitler government, they use the persecution of German communists as two things, you could say. It's one way to further the political and judicial power of the new regime, and it's also used in order to frame itself as a government that takes care of its people and protects it from radical left. So, an important part of the popularity of the first Hitler government comes from its very strong persecution of German communists.
Mm. Now, I remember that I don't remember, I wasn't there, but remember reading that Goebbels had put in his diary how he rejoiced that the Reichstag fire actually was such convenient for the Nazis, if propaganda-wise as well. So, and again, we have thought about as well how this would be the bit that you said earlier. This would be the first step in the banning of the political parties. That so that the only the Nazi political party would be the only remaining political party in Germany as well.
Yes, you could say that the Reichstag fire decree, which is then a law that comes into practice shortly after the fire, it's signed by the president Hindenburg. It severely limits the civil rights of German citizens, and it gives the government and the police, and then also then the paramilitary wing of the Nazi movement, the SA, the legal right to place people in so-called Schutzhaft, which is then some kind of custody where you can place them without putting them on trial. So it's a tool to be used in order to persecute political opponents, placing them in prisons, concentration camps, without the need of actually a thorough judicial examination. So it establishes some kind of a state of emergency that just goes on for weeks, months, and years. And you could say it's the first of many building blocks of the Nazi dictatorship. And making these kind of emergency laws was quite popular or understood among the German populace. It was a lot of people could understand that it was important to go to these kind of measures in order to combat what was then perceived as an immediate threat towards German society from the radical left. So it was extremely convenient, as you say, and it was used then by the Nazis in order to move towards dictatorships, making themselves not be forced to or closed in by judicial or political limitations.
Hmm. Now, the next topic is, of course, who gets to live in Hitler's Germany, and of course, I'm talking about who like the rock races and beliefs and religion. So who gets to so what kind of Germany did Hitler try to create as soon as he got into power, and how, because we talked about how anti-Semitism was a big part of his political campaign as well. Maybe not as big as the anti-communism, but what kind of people were worthy of being German in Hitler's eyes?
Yes, because moving on from the Reichstag fire decree, we have another very important element in establishing the Nazi dictatorship. That's the Enabling Act of March 1933, in which it is made into a law that the government and then crucially the Chancellor himself as a Hitler can make new laws without going through the National Assembly, without going through the Parliament, which is, of course, it's an very instructive part of the Nazi dictatorship because you can actually govern without any parliamentary support. And a third law that is crucial in establishing not only the Nazi dictatorship, but also then the fundamental view of how the Nazis wanted the new Germany to become is the law of April 7th, 1933, the law for the restoration of the civil service, which is essentially a law that makes it possible to remove people from public service that the Nazi government think is unreliable. That is mostly then political opponents. So we see a movement during April specifically, but also during the rest of the spring and summer, where social democrats, communists, and other opponents are removed from their positions. The crucial part of this law of April 7th, 1933, is that it's the first law issued in Nazi Germany that has a so-called Aryan paragraph. And it says that non-Aryan people can also be removed from their positions within the civil government. So this is the first law that actually targets Jewish people in Germany. So in this sense, you can say that non-Aryan is more or less a code word for a Jew or a Jewish person. And it is significant as it's the first, of course, then of many laws that limit how Jewish people in Germany can actually live their lives. Jewish people are not specifically targeted by the first laws where political opponents are persecuted, tortured, and murdered. Those Jewish people that are, you could say, caught up in this are treated more badly than those that are non-Jews, but this is the first law where Jewish people are targeted specifically. So we see that Jewish people that hold civil service positions like teachers, professors, doctors, lawyers can then be removed from their positions. And that happens now quite frequently during the spring and summer of 1933. So it's quite clear in the earliest weeks and months of the Nazi government that Jewish people will find it very, very difficult to be fully members of German society. That's not something that the new government is making a secret at all. But the important thing here is also that in addition to this, you could say governmental or judicial persecution of the Jews, it is important to the new Nazi government to have the German population itself to socially exclude Jewish people in their everyday life. And this also happens quite frequently, and we see this in all kinds of societies in all Germany, that Jewish people are removed from their memberships. They're kicked out of riding clubs, chess clubs, choirs, or
Universities.
political groups, also universities, and removed from their positions. And this quite often happen before it is made into a mandatory law. Before the government makes it mandatory to kick out Jewish history professors, they are removed from their positions by the universities themselves. So here we can see that the large parts of the German population move in tandem with the new Nazi government.
Now, something else as well, but what about other races such as, for example, gypsies, or as for example, such known, not nomadic, but what, but gypsies as well, and other such minorities in Germany.
Yes, the term gypsy is used in the in this historical period, of course, or the German word Zigeuner. Uh, Today, we would refer to them as the Roma population or the Romani population of Germany. They are not really targeted by the Nazi government at this early period. There is not a very specific policy towards the Roma population of Germany until later during the Nazi regime from the 1936 onwards. So, members of the Roma community in Germany are persecuted by the Nazi government, but then usually indirectly. Beginning 2 or 3 years later, after the first Hitler government, there is a persecution of what the Nazis called asocials. These are members
Yeah.
of society that the Nazis do not think are contributing members, that they should not have a position in society. This could be people that are homeless, people that are out of work, alcoholics, prostitutes, people living on the, like we said, on the outskirts or in on different sub sections of society. They are targeted from 1935 onwards. And also then the Roma population are usually or quite often also prosecuted in this period.
Mm.
But in the earliest phase, 1933 onwards, there is no specific policy against the Roma population.
Mm. I want to. You mentioned the asocials there, and I want to bring up my next topic is because unemployment was one of the re things Hitler ran on as a campaign as well to get a low unemployment rate, and of course, how did he tackle this? Because we start to see the building of the autobahn, etc., and etc., and putting people in, trying to put people into work, though it was so how did he handle because it did manage on paper at least to make it look like Germany has such a low unemployment rate. But of course, I mean, as mentioned, that with the rest of the socials and those who hasn't worked in a long time, they, that's partly also, I believe, why they managed to get such a low unemployment rate. So let's talk about how he managed to do make such a low unemployment rate possible.
Yes, it's a very important topic, and it's also quite interesting, I think, to understand the popularity of the Nazi regime in Germany and the first Hitler governments from 1933. There was huge unemployment, especially in the winter of 1932, 1933, and it reached about 6 million people in Germany. The figure was, of course, very much higher in reality because some people had been unemployed for a long time that they were not able to receive unemployment benefits anymore. So they were then taken out of the statistics. And quite a lot of people also worked forced part-time, that they were not able to have a full-time position. So in reality, the number of people that was not working full-time was even then higher. So this was maybe one of the first and most serious political economic challenges that the new government had to tackle. Now, Hitler himself, or most of people within the leadership of the Nazi party, they are totally not interested in fighting unemployment at all. They don't care even a bit. So Hitler is not the person that wants to fight unemployment. He doesn't want to reduce unemployment. But he understands that this is a major economic problem that has to be tackled. So what they are most interested in is not tackling unemployment, but tackling unemployment statistics. So one of the first ploys they do is to more like cooking the books or trying to reduce the number of registered unemployed people. One of the tricks they do is to offer a job to a person that is unemployed in a different part of the country. And if he does not accept this job because he has to travel or move to a totally different part, maybe he has a wife and children or a family and doesn't want to uproot from where this person lives, then he's then removed from the unemployment statistics. So the number of unemployed goes down, of course, at least officially. What the new German government also does is to start quite a lot of many projects to employ people. Now, these are funded by funds that the previous chancellors of Germany have made available, and they are then sitting on the desk of the chancellor's desk of Hitler when he arrives in January 1933. So tens of millions of Reichsmark are then able to the Nazis are able to open up new projects. Some of them are road construction, like you mentioned, the Autobahn. Most of them are what we can call different projects in order to turn forests, marshes, swampland into arable land, because this is work that is very work intensive. You need a lot of people, and they deliberately try to use as little of technical gear as they can, because if you can employ more people if you have 20 person with a shovel than you have with one huge excavator. So they try to use as less technical equipment in order to put more people into work. So there is an element of work creation, but the Nazis do this very reluctantly. They don't think that this is something that's important to them, and they do it, at least in the beginning, with funds that are made available to them from before. What they do, however, is to finance quite large projects in late spring of 1933. But we also have to see this as a part of the rearmament process that the
Yeah,
new Nazi government starts up quite immediately. They start these projects like road building, not as a attempt to remove unemployment, but to begin the gradual rearmament
yeah,
process in Germany, which is of course illegal according to the Versailles Treaty. Uh, there has been a lot of discussion whether the first Nazi government were under-financing this, that they found credits in order to finance work schemes, and they do, but they do it to rearm Germany, not to fight unemployment.
mm,
But the reality is, of course, that a lot of people actually find work because the German economy is improving. And the crucial part here is this is not because of the Nazis, but they get the credit for doing so. And this is the crucial part. The Germans people see that things are changing, jobs are created, and they credit Hitler and the Nazis for this, even if that's not their intention.
mm. Let's talk about the defiance of the Versailles Treaty because, as they were only, because I think we talked about this last time, is that they were only allowed to have a certain number of troops and weapons and, tanks, etc. in the army. But something I wanted to add as a side note here is that, of course, secretly they had armies and training in the Soviet Union as well during the Weimar Republic, and they worked collaborated with these having a secret army, so to speak, in the Soviet Union, while they were without the Allies' knowledge. So let's talk about how Hitler came, and this of course would increase his popularity tremendously as well, because he ran in this campaign to defy the November criminals, as he called them, and defy the Versailles Treaty. So let's talk about how Hitler managed to defy the Versailles Treaty and in eventually tear it apart, or the whole thing apart.
Yes, this is a huge subject because there are many
Hmm.
parts of the Versailles Treaty, but you could say that from the outset, the Hitler government is adamant that they want to remove Germany from all its international obligations, including the repayment system. And now, again, this is not something new. There is a strong element of continuity here because all German governments prior to the Hitler government in 1933 also wanted the same. But you could say that the new government follows this policy with more radical means. Hitler quite soon removed Germany from all discussions of disarmament. There is international committees working on how Europe can disarm. So they removed Germany for that quite soon, and they tried to lower and reduce the repayment that Germany are supposed to pay. And they, of course, then use the economic crisis following of the 1929 crash of the American economy that also struck Germany quite rapidly in order to reduce the payment system. So, but again, this is not something that's really, really new. But you can say the rhetoric and the symbolism connected to this is more radical with the Nazi government. And again, there has been collaboration, particularly then with the Soviet Union, where they are training German airplane pilots and also constructing German aircraft in secret factories in the Soviet Union beginning in the 1920s. There's also German submarines being built by Finnish wharfs that are supposed to be used in the new German army when it is established. So this is policies that are in place before Hitler comes to power. What is new is that with the new Nazi government, there is a much stronger emphasis on preparing Germany for war. One of the very, very first meeting that Hitler has as a Reich Chancellor only a few days after he is then given this position in early February 1933, he meets with the leading figures of the German military, the armed forces, and he spells out very clearly to them what his immediate foreign policy goals are. They are to re-establish Germany as the leading continental power in Europe. And he has, at this point, quite vague ideas about how this is supposed to be done, but he's quite clear towards the military leadership of Germany that he wants to re-establish the armed forces as a significant power structure within the state like it used to be before the Democratic Republic, and that he wants to create a German dictatorship in order to make new fundament for German armed forces to conquer Europe.
Mm. Now, the next topic, I mean, I will make an episode on this where we focus on the defiance of the Versailles Treaty of Court in more detail in the future. But we have a lot of topics to discuss today, so we have to move on. And the next topic is, of course, the Night of the Long Knives, which is one of the crucial events. We mentioned Ernst Röhm, who was crucial, like we said, was crucial for the SA movement and the and how getting Hitler in power. And as I mentioned last week, he was a homosexual as well. And this didn't matter to Hitler until he came into power. And what one of the things that was threatening to Hitler as well is that Rome wanted to use the SA as replacing the army, and if he wanted to become head of the this SA army. Of course, this would later be replaced by Gestapo and SS under Himmler. But let's talk about how the Night of the Long Knife became a crucial part in the early Third Reich government.
Yes. As we mentioned previously, the SA is instrumental in establishing the Nazi regime in power in during 1933 and also in spring, summer, and the autumn, and going into 1934. You can say they are the violent arm, so to speak, together with the police. They're also used as political activists, where they persecute Jewish people. They can storm into a Jewish-owned store, beating up the family running it. They can persecute Jewish journalists or social democratic trade union leaders or anyone that the regime targets as its enemy. So they're used very much also as like political activists. Now, there is a backlash to this within German society because quite a lot of people react to this violence. When this violence is framed in legal terms, like using the Reichstag fire decree in order to persecute communists and social democrats, most Germans think that this is okay. But when they experience that the violence, for instance, against Jewish people is illegal, they react quite negatively. So this is the activism and the violence of the SA also causes difficulties for the new Nazi regime because they are then alienating the new government from its population. So they try. So that's one of the reasons why Hitler and others close to him wants to limit the power of the SA. Like we mentioned in the previous episode, it doesn't matter to Hitler that Röhm is a homosexual. There's also a quite, at least in the 1980s, there were written several books about that was the main reason
Mm.
why the SA was removed as a political power in Nazi Germany. That is no reason to actually believe in that. This is a power struggle. And the what many of the activists in the SA want in 1933 is to gain access into positions of power and to enrich themselves as some kind of tribute for being important to the Nazi movement for many, many years. So we see that many persons with leading positions within the SA, they become majors in German cities. They benefit from what we call Aryanization of Jewish property, like if let's say a Jewish-owned factory or shop is then removed from the Jewish family, they're quite often given to people with connections to the SA. So they want you can also say that elements of the SA want the revolution to continue. They want the new Nazi government to become more radical and also to have more radical social policies than the leadership of the Nazi government is prepared to do. But it is, as you say, when the SA, and then particularly Röhm, who is a former army officer, talks about re-establishing the German army, which is of course more or less non-existent at this point because of the Versailles Treaty, but everybody's talking about it should be re-established again. And he says that the SA, the members of the SA, should be the backbone of this new army, a Volksarmee or a people's army made out of the militia of the Nazi movement. And of course, this is 100% anathema to the German officers. They do not want hundreds of thousands of political activists in the army. So it is when Röhm starts talking about this and moves towards creating a popular army, you could say, based of the SM membership, that his fate and those closest to him, their fates are sealed. And in June 1934, the Nazi movement or its leadership moves against and removes Röhm and his closest associates.
Mm.
And then this is in a period where the Nazi government experienced its first crises, because there are quite a lot of people that are frightened and scared of the Nazi takeover, of course, with very good reason, but also many Germans that think that this is a very good idea and support the new regime. But they, beginning from the summer of 1934, also the difficulties of the Nazi government is becoming more and more apparent, and it is not then that is the reason why Hitler and his close associates decide to strike against the SA, particularly at this time, because it's an opportune movement to show to the established elites of Germany that we are able to move against the radical elements within the Nazi movement. We remove them from power, we place them in prisons and concentration camps, and we murder their leaders. So we are to be trusted. We are not these radical people. We are someone that you can work together with. So it's not. It's of practical reasons why it's done in the summer of 1934.
Mm. Was the main target? What about were there other political opponents that were gunned down during the night of the Long Knife?
Yeah, there were several, many of them that had leading positions when the Nazi movement was in opposition. The most important of them was Gregor Strasser. That is a person, I don't think we mentioned him in the previous episode, but he's then the main organizer, you could say, of the Nazi movement and its development from 1925 onwards. You could say the leading figure about the administrative, organizational development of the Nazi movement that made it into this power house that it was in the early 1930s. He had then gotten into arguments with Hitler in late autumn of 1932, and he left the Nazi Party in December 1932 because of disagreement with Hitler on what would be the next course. He was killed, and so were also others that had important positions before the Nazi takeover of power of early 1933.
Hmm. Now, the next topic is a rather dark topic that we have to discuss, and that is, of course, the Life Unworthy of Life program that was instituted by Hitler and his people. So let's talk about what was the infamous Life Unworthy of Life in the Nazi government.
Yes, the idea that there are human beings, people that do not deserve to live, is an idea that predates the Nazi movement, also in
Hmm.
Germany.
I mean,
But you,
sterilizations were quite common for those they didn't want to reproduce, for example, even in the Weimar Republic, and not just in Germany, but entirety of Europe as well. That was quite common that those who were not worthy of reproduction were, for example, sterilized.
yes, this happens in a lot of countries. So Germany is not unique in this sense. It is unique in the sense of the radicalization of its policy, and it's also in
Mm.
the execution of the policy. And of course, when we get closer to the war in 1939, this kind of policy of sterilization then gradually evolves also into a policy of mass murder of
Mm.
many of the same people that were sterilized beginning in 1933 and 1934. But the idea is quite widespread in Europe or in the entire Western world in the earliest part of the 20th century. It has to
But in
do,
Sweden didn't abolish this until 1979 or something. That
yes, several countries have these kind of laws in place also after the Second World War.
mm.
Absolutely. And the basic idea is that with the emerging of the welfare state, uh, gradually developed from the late 19th century and maybe particularly after the First World War into the 1920s and 1930s, where the government takes, you could say, more responsibility for its population. This policy is then under significant pressure in the interwar period because of the economic difficulties that many countries face following the First World War. This happens in Germany and it happens in many other countries, and there is a discussion how should we spend the limited public welfare budgets that we have? Should we spend them on people that contribute? Should we spend them on people that go to work, pay their taxes, are law-abiding citizens? Or should we spend welfare funds on people that, in most people's opinion, do not contribute, do not work, do not pay taxes, and are more or less outside the normative society? And we mentioned them as asocials just a few minutes ago because that's a term that the Nazis use on them. But this is also a group in society that is constituted of people that have physical or mental illnesses that are unable to
Mm.
be 100% contributive members of society, at least as they are viewed at the time. So, the main idea is to limit the ability to reproduce among certain segments of society because there is an idea that these people reproduce at a very, very high rate and that they are then producing people that will never be contributing members of society. So these are not specifically the people that are life unworthy of life, because that's a term that's used on people that are mentally or physically sick that they are not able to function as an ordinary person. So you can say that in the 100 years that has passed since this is our view of these members of society has changed quite radically. But if we
For the
go 100
better,
years back,
perhaps.
for the better, I would absolutely say. But going 100 years back, this is a quite common idea also among ordinary people that we should not spend our official public welfare on people that cannot contribute. So there's quite a lot of backing for the laws that are introduced in 1933 and 1934 that introduces also forced sterilization of some quite unspecific groups. And these laws are not secret. They are written about in the newspapers and they are publicly discussed.
Mm,
And there's quite a lot of support for these kind of laws.
mm.
And you can say that it is the same people that are targeted by these sterilization laws that are also targeted by the mass murder of mentally and physically
Yeah.
handicapped persons that starts more or less in 1939.
Let's talk a little bit about the mass murder and, of course, and the getting rid of the mentally ill, because it was interesting. And I don't know if you read the book yet, but Lawrence Rees pointed out this in his recent book, The Nazi Mind. I'm not sure if you read it yet, but he points out that doctors actually willingly participated, and of course this is where we first get to use the Cyclone B. And in the book, Lawrence Rees, of course, asked the question: why did doctors who were supposed to have signed the Hippocratic, sorry, I don't remember the word, but the oath to preserve life. Why were they so willingly helping murdering the handicapped and disabled? That, with the Cyclone B, that why were they so participating in this project when they were sworn to, preserve life? Why were there so many complicit in this? And many of them got away with it too, and actually had decent jobs after the Second World War. So let's talk about why they were so eager in helping the Third Reich in this topic.
Yes. This is also a very important topic to bring up. I think it's well on the basic level, it's important to understand that the power shift of placing the Nazis in power in 1933 also introduced a biologization of German society. The Nazis were, of course, racists, and in the specific sense, not maybe how we view racism today, where we think that it's prejudice towards people that have a different skin color than you. They are racist in the sense that they view everybody as part of specific human races. They don't think there's one human race. They see that as many different races that are, of course, opposed to each other. So, whatever you were going to do as a citizen of Nazi Germany, whether you were applying for a job, whether you were applying for social benefits, which were massively increasing after 1933, whether you were trying to get into university or trying to get hold of a larger apartment to live in, you had to go through a medical examination. You had to prove to the government that you were of a sound racial stock, that you did not have any so-called hereditary illnesses that you could pass on to your next generation. So the Nazi Germany is a society that's focused on biology and your ability to be a productive member of your race.
A deranged
So
version of biology, you might say.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. So this is behind everything that the Nazi government introduces. They introduce a lot of new social benefits for the people that are within the in group, those who do not labeled as hereditary ill, but most of the funding and the backs or the dark side of this is, of course, to reduce any kind of benefits to those that are not regarded as a healthy member of society. So this is the background I think we have to have in order to understand this specific element of Nazi Germany, because it's very much part and parcel of this thinking. And you're quite right that a lot of people from the medical profession, not only doctors but also nurses, work in these kind of institutions where people that are labeled as hereditary ill are sterilized or later also murdered. And this goes out into all parts of German society. So every time there is the birth of a new child in Germany, the midwife is supposed to register with the authorities, is this a healthy boy or a girl or not? So it begins from birth. And to go to this medical examination is then quite dangerous because the doctor could actually find something. Maybe you had pneumonia a few years ago, or your hearing is a little bad, or your sight is not that good. So then you can be
I would be
removed
screwed then if
from.
it comes to hearing.
Sorry?
I would be screwed then if it comes to the hearing part.
Yeah. So it's very much connected to your biological state, you could say. And for these doctors or nurses or anybody from the medical profession, psychologists, psychiatrists that enforce this policy and also try to move it on, because the basic ideas for the persecution of the hereditary ill or the mentally or physically handicapped in Germany that the Nazis actually put into operation, these plans are already there when the Nazis come to power. So and their reasoning is that yes, they have sworn an oath to protect life, but they would say that they do. They protect the lives that are worthy of living, and they are removing the lives that are not worthy of living. You could say that they aid them from living these miserable lives, as they would say, and they would also say that they are keeping the German society alive. It's quite common within the Nazi movement to talk about German society or the German people as a living body, a Volkskörper, or as an embodiment of the people. And to remove these people that they think has a very negative influence is to keep the German body alive. So they would say that it's because of their Hippocratic oath, not opposed to it, that they are following this murderous policy.
I just think that
They
it's
are,
now a hypocritical oath.
yes, they are in their mind removing viruses, bacteria from the otherwise healthy body in order to make it stronger for the future.
Mm. Now, another thing I want to talk about is the Nazi government and Hitler's inner circle, because what is interesting, and again, I point to Lawrence Rees, who's a fantastic historian on the Third Reich in general, and written so many good books on this topic, is that the Nazi government made it look like, and with all the policies they put out, made it look like the Nazi government was running quite smoothly, but again, according to Lawrence Rees, that's quite the opposite is true. So let's talk about the chaotic mess that actually were the Nazi government.
Yes, it is running far from smoothly. Absolutely, there is. I think the one that has described this the best is in Sir Ian Kershaw in his Hitler biography. That was published in the early 2000s, so it's more than 20 years old now, but it's, in my opinion, by far superior compared to all other Hitler biographies. Is
It's
that
in my
he
bookshelf and
describes
waiting to be
very.
read.
Sorry?
It's in my bookshelf and it's waiting to be read.
Yes, you should absolutely do so. It's also a, social history of Germany, so it's a very good read. There are, I think we mentioned it also in the previous episode, what Nazism is, what the Nazi movement is very many different things. So this is a strength in the 1920s because they can appear to different sections of the German society in different ways in order to gather support. But this is also a challenge when the Nazi movement comes into power because people are not in agreement, and there is Hitler is not a person that is a ordinary politician in the sense that he gathers around him advisors or ministers that meet regularly to hammer out the basic outlines of the policies of Nazi Germany. That never happens. They almost never speak to each other, those that hold the most senior positions, you could say, of the new Nazi Germany. They, of course, they meet and they talk, but they never do that together. So Hitler's rule over the inner circle of the Nazi Party or over Nazi Germany itself has been compared more or less to a feudal rule of the Middle Ages, where his subordinates or people that have positions of power, they compete for Hitler's favor because there are a lot of, you could say, conflicting ideas, conflicting policies within the vast and quite complex Nazi movement, and the only deciding factor, the one with the necessary power in order to decide on this, is Hitler himself. And we see this, for instance, with the development or the destruction, you could say, of the SA that we just mentioned, and then the power shift from the SA to the SS and Heinrich Himmler. That is a conflict that has been going on for quite a long time. There are several other conflicts within how German economy should be governed, how rapid should changes take place, how violent should political opponents be persecuted. There are elements within the Nazi government that wants to limit how political opponents are persecuted, placed into concentration camp because it's dangerous to Germany's or the image of Germany abroad, which then, of course, has repercussions on the German economy, import and export market. And there are others that want to persecute political opponents much more severely than they actually do. So these conflicts are there all the time. And one of the theses of Ian Kershaw in his writing is the idea of working towards the Führer. So Hitler is not a detail-oriented dictator. He doesn't give specific orders, do this or do that. He gives vague instructions. Sometimes they are contradictory. And then it's up to other power brokers within this pyramid of power to actually try to carry out his what they perceive as his ideas and wishes. So it's in this competitive environment, you could say, that the actual policies of Nazi Germany are decided.
Also, he wanted an infighting between the inner circle of Germany because inner circle of his government because it made them easier to control, and in his view in his view it made them easier to control because when they were fighting each other, they were, like you said, they were always trying to become his favorites. So it made it easier to control them for his part. And another misconception, perhaps, that I think we mentioned before on this podcast is that the idea that they were low IQ, that they weren't very clever in or smart, is actually not true because most of these people inside the Hitler's inner circle were actually quite higher in IQ, and they were quite clever, and so that there was this misconception that they weren't very, they were just following Hitler's order, etc., doing what he
Mm.
said, but they were actually quite clever and not as low IQ as you might think they were.
Yes, there has for a very long time and also before 1933 this general conception that the leadership of the Nazi movement was like consisted of brutish fighters, thugs, barbarians, and there's been a tendency to view them as very concerned with political power, but without any ideological project or any actually idea what they wanted to do besides just getting into power. Um, that's not really the case. I think that's most of what's happening in Nazi Germany from 1933 onwards is partially driven by ideologically or politically driven, but it's there is never one specific a concept of Nazism that everybody agrees on. So they are moving, you could say, in different directions at the same time. And this also makes it difficult for those that are citizens of Nazi Germany actually to think about the future and to think how should we react to this authoritarian dictatorship that behave unscrupulously towards its political opponents. And we see this particularly with the Jewish population
Yeah.
of Germany. Of course, the Nazi government is a threat to the about 500,000 German Jews. But they are also very insecure about how should they respond. How should the Jewish communities
Mm.
in Germany respond to this threat that this obviously is? And there we tend to view Nazi Germany and the Nazi leadership as a very monolithic organization that moves in specific directions, and everybody knows what they are doing all the time. But there's a lot of complexity and contradictions. In the spring of 1933, there are several boycotts of Jewish businesses. There are Jewish store owners are kicked out of their business, and they are Aryanized, as we talked about. But we also see the totally opposing thing that also Hitler, in public, in all German newspapers, asks German consumers to visit Jewish stores. And then specifically the large department stores in the larger cities like Berlin, Hamburg, that some of them were Jewish owned, or like Jewish family owned brands. And according to Nazi ideology, these stores should be removed. The Jewish store owners should be kicked out. But that would have serious economic repercussions because hundreds of thousands of people were dependent of these large department stores, the producers and people working in them. So this is not something that the Nazi government cannot afford these department stores to go bankrupt because then many people will be unemployed. So there is a complexity here. And for Jewish people that were thinking about should we stay in Germany? Should we move abroad? Should we try to flee? They have to try to make sense of this complexity. And when they see things like this, that the Nazi government is being modest, at least compared to their radical policy, they think that, okay, maybe things won't be as bad. Maybe Hitler and the Nazis, they will have to modify themselves when they are faced by economic reality. So maybe things won't be this bad. And that's also one of the reasons why most German Jews choose to stay. And many of them are then also staying so long that it's when it becomes impossible to flee the country when the war starts.
Something interesting as well that I forgot to mention earlier was that Hindenburg, who wanted Hitler to ease off on the Jewish veterans that, were had fought in World War One, and he actually upholds this promise to Hindenburg until he dies at least, and many Jewish veterans actually thought they would be safe because they had fought in the First World War as well. So, and many were for some time until, of course, the death of Hindenburg later in 1933.
Yes, Hindenburg dies in the summer of 1934.
Yes,
And this is
34, sorry.
yeah, August 34, and this is when then Hitler resumes, you could say, both the chancellorship and the presidentship of Germany, and he creates this Führer position. And it is an symbolic of how the Nazis were dependent on others when they came first into power in 1933. They did not have total political, economic power. They had to work with others. So they are also relying specifically in the first months on the goodwill of the president Hindenburg and the close circle around him. So that's why they make these concessions. And when members of the Jewish community, or at least some of them in Germany, are targeted by Nazi thugs, they often dress up in their former army uniforms with their Iron Cross on their uniforms in order to show the German people that we are Germans. We have bled and fought for this country. We deserve something better. And we have many examples also in this campaign that we mentioned where the mentally or physically ill persons are sterilized or also murdered, that former veterans from the war are exempt from this policy, and we have examples of people that are actually brought into these killing institutions and are on the physical threshold of the gas chamber, but they show up in their army uniforms, and that's why they are then sent back and are allowed to live out their life. So it was used as like a symbolic presentation of I am a German citizen, so that also some Jewish people were able to use this as a and able to escape the worst persecution. But in general, this is an exemption, of course, and later in the regime, this is not something that is possible.
Hmm. And then, no, the next topic I want to discuss is the art program that was initiated by the Third Reich government, of course. And Hitler and the Nazis were not necessarily fans of modern art, and this would lead to artwork and I forget the word, but the program where they will distribute art, modern art, if and see look at how disgusting this modern art is, and you know, and according to I believe Richard J. Evans in his three-volume biography, he mentioned that it was maybe for the wrong reason that these became such popular things because they actually enjoyed looking at the modern art, even though they tried to work the new Third Reich tried to work make the other point that it was look at how this horrible modern art is. And let's talk about artwork in the Nazi Germany a little bit.
Yes, interesting topic, absolutely, and again filled with a lot of complexity and contradiction, as most things in Nazi Germany are. Um,
Kind of had our common
the
theme there.
Yeah, absolutely, yes, and you could say that um, the Nazi movement gradual takeover of power in Germany in 1933, 1934 is very much a political project. It's an
Mm,
ideologically driven project. They want to change Germany.
mm. And if I may
One,
interrupt you for one brief
yes.
second, and we should also mention that in Weimar Germany, in the Weimar Republic, modern art were actually quite popular and they were quite progressive in with both art and sexuality, as I think we mentioned. So, imagine
Mhm.
going from the Weimar Republic where modern art were actually promoted, and then you get modern art in the Third Reich being, and being not being stopped being promoted, but the vast difference between also one difference between Weimar and the Third Reich as well.
Mm, yes, and you could say yes. Basically, that's how it's quite usually perceived, and there were, of course, much better working environment for modern artists in the liberal democratic Weimar Republic than it was in the authoritarian, totalitarian dictatorship of Nazi Germany. But the support or the you could say the popularity of modern art was never universal, either in the Weimar Republic, but you could say that the working conditions were much better. But there were millions of Germans who resented everything that had to do with cultural modernism and resented much of the cultural or like flagships that we know today and that we have been discussing and talking about a lot in the also in the post-war era. Many of these symbolic modernist masterpieces were despised by most Germans in the 1920s. Just give one brief example, this film Metropolis.
Mm.
It's one of the most celebrated movies of all times, very important in changing and how Hollywood made films later. And the director Fritz Lang moved to the US and Hollywood, of course. But this movie only screened for a few days in Germany because nobody went to see it, and it led to that the movie company, the UFA, Universum Film, went bankrupt and was bought by a extreme right wing media mogul that helped Hitler into power in 1933. So it's a more complex issue than that. Everybody liked modern art in Weimar and everybody hated it in the Nazi era. So there was quite a lot of resentment against this norm-breaking modern art among many Germans. So that's also why many of them supported the persecution of particularly modernist artists in Germany after 1933. And the term that the Nazis used is entartet Kunst, degenerate art.
Yeah.
That was quite popular among the German population. And we see that the first people that flee from Germany in 1933, in addition to political opponents like communists and social democrats, there are many modernist artists because they see that it is no longer a possible working environment for us. We may be persecuted. But we also see that many modernist artists remain, and we also see that some of them were given quite good working conditions and were also hailed by publicly by the Nazi regime. So again, there is more complex picture. One of the best examples of this figure that is very complex is a painter called Emil Nolde. He's a modernist painter that was frequently persecuted as an entarted artist in the early 1930s. And in this exhibition that was opened in 1937 in Munich, the Entartete Kunst exhibition, where like several of modernist painting sculptures were exhibited in order to show people how bad this was and how crazy it was. Many of his pictures are there, but he was also used as a painter in other situations, and he was also popular amongst certain high-ranking Nazi officials, particularly Joseph Goebbels, that has several Emil Nolde paintings in his own house. So again, there is not easy to paint a very one-dimensional picture. But the
Yeah.
basic idea is that the Nazis were very concerned about culture, and in their attempt to change German society into something else, a racial community prepared for war, prepared to give up everything in order to fight for the political and geopolitical ambitions of the Nazi leadership, culture played an important part. And then I use culture as a quite wide theme. What kind of music were played in the radio? What kind of books were published? What did they learn in school? What did they teach at the universities? They were trying to move German society in specific direction, and cultural field of society was an important part of this revolutionary movement of German society.
Mm. So the
But
next,
again, we
so yeah.
cannot paint a very
Yeah.
one-sided and one-dimensional picture.
Mm. Now, another thing that also were quite popular, at least in the early years of the third and the midterm of the Third Reich in power, was of course the infamous Strength Through Joy program, which was it was labeled where the normal working class citizen could take a vacation, for example, to Norway, Norwegian fjords, or other parts, Scandinavian tours, or other parts of France, perhaps, and other that they may not be able to visit otherwise. So let's talk about the holiday program that would were called Strength to Through Joy.
Mm. Yes, the strength through joy. It's a very interesting title in itself. And the Kraft durch Freude. It was part of the German Labor Front, the Deutsche Arbeitsfront. That was some kind of quasi trade union that was established in 1933 when all the independent trade unions were abolished, like the Social Democratic Trade Union, the Communist, but also the more like Catholic-oriented trade unions were either abolished or they then dissociated themselves. The Deutsche Arbeitsfront, the Nazi trade union or like trade union, was the only allowed organization for working people. It was not a trade union in the original sense that it was like a power broker between the employer and the employees. It was a tool of the political regime. It was a political tool in order to change German society in the direction that the leadership of the Nazi regime wanted it to militarize and to control the workers. So one of the main challenges faced by the Nazi government was that it wanted to rearm, and it did so. It was massive changes in German industry, economy, infrastructure in order to rearm. And this changed the German economy very significantly, and the would in a normal a capitalist economy lead to increased wages and increased prices because the economic output in certain branches was extremely high. So in order to move workers from different parts of industry to others, they would increase the wages. But this is something that the government wanted to reduce in order to control the economic development of Germany. And the Deutsche Arbeitsfront is one of the most important tools they use to control working life. But what they try to give instead is the Kraft durch Freude, the strength through joy program. And you mentioned the holiday travels to Norwegian fjords or to Madeira or to the Mediterranean. And this is what we usually remember from this now. But this was, in essence, from its beginning, a rather small part of the Strength Through Joy program.
Yeah.
Firstly, most of the holidays were in Germany itself, and they were maybe for a couple of days or a short week. And usually they went to border regions of Germany in order to strengthen, you could say, the bonds between the German population and these border regions with France or Poland that were contested after the First World War. And it was also sent the holidaymakers into these areas in order to increase the economic activity of these regions because many of them were quite depressed in the 1930s. So the most significant part of the Strength Through Joy program is other kind of cultural activities like concerts, theater performances, shipping or busing people around from the countryside into the larger cities so they can visit the library or they can go on a tour to see like some German castles or more like touristy stuff, but then mostly within Germany itself. Because these trips are much less expensive than these longer and more like flamboyant overseas cruises to Norway or to Madeira or the Mediterranean.
Mm.
And not many people are actually able to take part in these cruises. But the idea that they exist and the idea that if you are a very good worker, that you never ask any critical questions, that you turn up for work every day, you may be awarded with trips like these. That's an important carrot for many German workers that they can be repaid for their for their heavy labor for the new regime by going on trips like these. And the idea is to sell them as something that is available to the German working class. Like being a tourist is a very middle class thing also in the 1920s, 30s. That's not something ordinary workers can afford. And usually they don't have enough vacation either to actually go on trips like this. If we look at the actual and most popular trips, like these more longer cruise trips to Norway or other places, um, the the actual element of working class workers going on these trips were quite low. They were usually given as some special treat to people with positions within the Nazi party. So people that were like you could say repaid for their loyalty and work for the party and the government and not usually an ordinary worker. But it happened. And there was a lot of ideological propaganda you could use from this because they made some new cruise ships where all the cabins of the cruise ships were the same. Like there was just one class. And so symbolically, there was a lot of power in this, you could say. But in reality, there was not many people from ordinary working class background that actually could take part in these kind of cruises. So it's more this more everyday, low key, low level cultural program that was awarded was much more popular and much more common.
Mm. Now, if I remember correctly, I think they also had not everything was covered financially, so you even had to think about financial as well when you went to this trip, such as bring your own food, for example, or I may be mixing it up because East Germany had a similar program in during their run, so I may be mixing up stuff here. So forgive me, but if I remember correctly, you weren't always financially covered with such things, food, clothing, etc. When you went to the trips. If I so you had to think also of financial costs, not just the trip itself, but also all the other stuff that you needed to bring with you.
Yes, absolutely. So if you were lucky enough to be awarded a place on like a cruise to Madeira and on this Portugal island in the Atlantic, which was very popular, you could not perhaps afford to go on daily excursions. You could not buy the most expensive food in the restaurants. And of course, Germany, like any other country in the 1930s, is a very class-oriented society. You could see on a person usually what kind of class they belong to, even if they are on a cruise. You could see it on their hands. You can listen to the way they talk. So a working class people will give themselves away, you could say, because you could see it on them, and you could listen to the dialects or the social acts or what they talk about or how their hands look, of course. So the Nazi idea is of a classless society. This idea of a Volksgemeinschaft, the national community of Germans, where your class background is irrelevant. What only matters is your racial value. That's the idea that the Nazis are selling to the Germans. It doesn't matter what kind of background you have, if you have an education or not, if you are rich or you're poor, if you're a worker or a rich person, you are a German. That is what matters. But of course, in reality, the class divisions were still very much present also in Nazi Germany, but selling this idea, this utopian idea of a classless society was quite popular among huge segments of the German population.
And again, you can see kind of why the early historians of fascism compared these to ideologies to communism as well, because there as well you have the idea of a classless society as well. So you can see the comparison between the mistake of thinking the Nazis were as well as it's just this last episode as well, so we don't have to go too much into it, and then it's realized time is running out. But yeah, you can see the why people mistake Nazism for communism as well. Now, the next topic is, of course, crucial for the Third Reich to function, and that is propaganda in the Third Reich. So that's of course, and you mentioned Joseph Goebbels at the time. He was of course instrumental in making propaganda for the Third Reich. So let's talk about how propaganda functioned for the Nazi government.
Yeah, huge topic, also this one.
Mm.
And again, we have to look at the complexity. Because when we think about propaganda of Nazi Germany, it's quite easy to get images of huge mass rallies, maybe from the Nuremberg party
Yeah,
rallies, banners, tens of thousands of people lining up for these huge party Reichsparteitage. This is the party rallies every autumn and these huge spectacular events. And of course, they are part of the Nazi propaganda. And you could say that the idea of Nazi propaganda is to convey an image or a symbolic image of the unity of Germans and their unity against every kind of opponent that the Nazi regime itself would identify. To give the image of a racial community that is united against its enemy and united in removing the enemies from within. We talked about those that the Nazi government said were not worthy of life. They are then, of course, seen as an internal enemy that the German population has to alienate themselves from. But the major, of course, internal enemy in the views of the Nazi government are, of course, the Jewish people of Germany. So then to portray the image of we are together, we are working for the same common goals, we are rebuilding Germany, we are creating jobs, we are moving on economically, we are doing this together, and at the same time, we are removing our internal enemies that have been keeping us at bay before. That's the major propaganda message, you could say, to the German people. And these huge events, these mass rallies, they are part of this. But if we look also more like into everyday life in small communities, it's much of this propaganda is then communicated through radios. And the radio is, of course, a relatively new kind of technology in the 1930s. The radio is not a very common thing in Germany in 1933, but quite consciously, the Nazi government tries to make quite affordable radio receivers, and they sell them to a reduced price in order to use the radio as some kind of a communicative tool with the German population. And a bit like television was in the post-war era, and also like you could say the internet and social media is today, it's not a one-way communication. The radio is also used like a two-way communication where the population can communicate with the regime. Because many of the most popular programs are programs where people are then, of course, like sending letters and postcards to the programs, and then they're read out where people maybe can wish for specific music or specific songs or send greetings to the relatives. And of course, after 1939, this is also very much used to communicate between the home front and the soldiers fighting the war, because most of them, these greetings that were read out in the radio were, of course, communication within families with people at the front. So the radio is very much used as a tool for propaganda. They are broadcasting every speak that Hitler held or any other major player in the Nazi government held. So it's used as a political propaganda tool. But what we should also remember here is that most of the content of radio program was not political. It was entertainment. And Nazi Germany is very progressive in the sense that it tries to address its political views through light entertainment, like musical plays or in like studio programs with
movies.
guests and discussions. So it's not like this the image we have of Nazi propaganda is like this huge
Mm.
mass rallies, Hitler speaking, very political, very overtly ideological. The most used and most effective was this everyday political communication that went through light entertainment.
Mm. Now, then we have to talk about Goebbels' part in this, of course, because he was the propaganda chief minister, and of course,
Yes.
so we can't talk about propaganda without talking about Goebbels. So let's talk about his involvement in the propaganda machine.
Yes. So, where should we begin? Joseph Goebbels is a very educated person. He has a doctorate in German linguistics from one of the leading universities of Germany. And like many others, leading Nazis, he holds a doctorate. So you mentioned previously that many of them were quite educated and skilled and intelligent people. His major influence comes from his running of the propaganda department, and beginning in the late spring of 1933, you could say that this propaganda department gains control over more or less not everything, but most of the public sphere in Germany. They control most of the newspapers, radio programs, and other kinds of cultural exchange, like music, literature, in Germany. It doesn't control everything in the sense that Goebbels can give directions, do this, do that in all of society. It's never possible to control a society of like 50, 60 million people every day directly. So the actual control is quite limited, but where it is quite direct is in instructions given to German newspapers, news agencies, and radio channels on what they are allowed to broadcast and not, and how they should portray various events in newspapers. So it's not like every newspaper is run by the Nazis. You also have like more or less um, independent newspapers, but there's still very closely monitored by the propaganda department what they are allowed to publish and how they should portray specific events, like abroad or in Germany. Um, let's say, for instance, a significant event in November 1938, the November pogrom, or the so-called Reichskristallnacht, this pogrom against Jews in November 1938, then Goebbels gave very specific directives to every newspaper. How should you write about this? What should you avoid? And again, this is how we are going to write about this. So this control is one of the major tools that Goebbels has to his disposal.
Mm. Now, I was going to discuss the Winter Olympics or the Olympics in Germany, but I realized we may not have time to do this today, and I may cover this when the Winter Olympics this year come out in February, where I actually will be going because my brother is competing in skiing that in the winter. Just a little shout out, but I realized I don't have time to discuss this. So one of the last topics that I want to discuss is the acquiring of new territory by Hitler, because of course he always talked about, and this is of course where we talked about the rearmament program become important as well, because the army, of course, and he managed to rebuild the army, and by 1936, of course, the big gamble, and he talked about how the ethnic Germans living outside of Germany where should belong to the Reich, such as, for example, Austrians should be a part of Germany and, the part of Czechoslovakia. We will come back to that later, of course, and Danzig, where the free city of Danzig should become part of the Third Reich as well. But first of all, I want to talk about the big gamble that would be the Rhineland, which was French territory from 1918 until today. So let's talk about the big gamble that would be retaking the Rhineland.
Yes. Rearmament is a significant part of Nazi Germany from 1933 onwards. Like I mentioned, one of the first meeting Hitler has as a new chancellor is with the leading actors in the military. One of the second first meeting that he has also in February 1933 is with leading industrialists, where he lays out his ideas of how Germany should be structured in order to increase industrial production and reduce the rights of German workers, so they are then easier to produce more of everything that is needed for rearmament, to move power from the workers to the employers, to the large industrialists, in order to create the tools for Germany to become a leading military power again. So that's the major political project you could say that Hitler and leading Nazis have: make Germany able to recreate the map of Europe in the immediate future. How and when this is supposed to happen, they have vague ideas, but that's the absolute outcome. And of course, Hitler and the Nazis, they are dependent on the army from 1933 onwards. They are the major physical power in Germany. They are reduced, of course, as you say, to 100,000 people, but that's more than enough to remove Hitler and the Nazis from power if they would like to do so.
And
So
they were talk
he's
about doing so in the
several
late
times,
era.
yes. Yes, absolutely. But so Hitler has to pursue a policy that the leading officers are in agreement with. And of course, they are very positive to a societal and industrial economical change that moves the army into the center of politics again. And the rearmament creates a lot of possibilities for the military leadership of Germany. That's also one of the reasons why they support Hitler and the Nazis. So the but the so the shift, you could say, into a war-like economy in Germany in peacetime is significant. It's the strongest shift in a capitalist economy ever, from civilian production to military production. Much of this is camouflaged because Germany is not allowed to rearm. There are weapons inspectors in Germany all the time, from Britain, from France, inspecting German factories and checking whether they are producing weapons or not. So they camouflage this in their budgets, and they camouflage this in their industrial production. Like they say that they are producing tractors, but they are in reality
Yeah.
producing prototypes of tanks. And they produce civilian airplanes that can quite easily be converted into military bombers. So they have to be careful.
Big
But
armament
it's
factories such as Krupp and Thyssen, of course, were a big part in the rearmament.
absolutely, yeah, yes. So and this shift from a civilian capitalist production into a more or less, not completely, but more or less state controlled or like a
Mm.
politically controlled military armaments production causes significant damages to German economy because the rearmament is so large that the German economy cannot contain it, and it causes an extremely rapid demand for foreign currency because many of the parts that German industry need in order to rearm, they have to import from other countries. Like German, Swedish iron ore, for instance, has to be bought, or Belgian iron ore that's much better than the German iron ore. So they had to buy this in foreign currency. So one of the major problems for German economy or for the Hitler government is to get enough of this currency. So they create a very complex system of control so that only industries that are directly contributing to the rearmament industry are allowed to import things to Germany. So those that are not, like the textile industry or other parts they make that also have to import things, they go more or less bankrupt during this extremely shift to military production.
Mm.
So
And then, if
already
I'm
from
sorry for
19
interrupting you again, but one thing that I want to mention as well that I think is important is the Volkswagen program that also helped contribute to the rearmament program as well, because Hitler promised that if you paid a certain amount of money into the Volkswagen or the car that should the propaganda was that every German should have an affordable car, which was of course a lie from Hitler's side because they never got this car, at least not because most of the money that was sent in to the Volkswagen program were of course used to rearmament program instead of giving the Volkswagen car as to the German people.
Yeah, so the Volkswagen project is a way to actually borrow money from your own population and then never
Or
repay
steal.
them in yes repay them with the product that you are going say that you are going to give them. And this is a state-run project because there's no car manufacturer in Germany that is willing to take this on because the demand from Hitler and the Nazis is that they should sell this car for 1,000 Reichsmarks, which is then actually below the production cost itself. So there's no car maker in Germany that is willing to take this silly, stupid idea on. So they had to do it themselves. They built a new factory in Germany that is supposed to compete with the Ford factories of Detroit in production that doesn't really work. And the what they produce in this factory later is, of course, then parts for tanks or other parts of the German army. They never produce any cars, or specifically not cars suitable for the personal market or German families. So it's but so this is an example of more like stupid or idiotic ideas that are pursued in Nazi Germany. And what becomes quite clear as early as 1934, 1935, is that Hitler and the Nazi government are destroying German economy in order to increase rearmament. They are rearming at a pace that is much, much higher than the German economy can actually encompass. So they are gambling 100% because they cannot continue doing this shift to armament at the pace that they are doing. The plans are totally unrealistic. If you look at the plans for how the German naval fleet is supposed to rearm, it's totally bonkers. If they took all the steel in Germany, all the workers, they will not be able to actually fill these quotas. So they're fantasy figures. But also what's happening in reality is destroying German economy from within. There is no, they are rearming too fast and too radical. So that's why in the late 1930s, the Nazi government has to decide, do we slow down rearmament in order for the economic situation in Germany to cool down and to catch up? Or do we pursue it even more radical and destroy German economy even faster in the attempt to become competitive with our neighbors France, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union? And of course, Hitler insists on the latter course. So already 1937, 38, 39, German economy is more or less ceased to function, and it is held in place by very strict government regulations in order to keep the rearmament process going without destroying the economic fabric, you could say, of Germany totally. But this bubble is about to burst. So the Rhineland you mentioned in
Yeah.
1936, the occupation of the Rhineland is an important shift, you could say, towards a more radical rearmament. Because at this moment, it's in the spring of 1936, the Nazi government gives a very public and very profiled step away from international cooperation and the Versailles Treaty. They have, of course, breached it many, many times before, the introduction of conscription in Germany in 1935, the construction of the Wehrmacht as the new armed forces, the introduction of an air line, also the Luftwaffe also in 1935 is of course a breach with the Versailles Treaty. The occupation of the Rhineland is even more spectacular in this sense. It is not a part of France. It is still a part of Germany. It's the left bank or the western bank of the Rhine River up to the French border, but it is supposed to be demilitarized. It is still a part of Germany, but is not allowed to have any military presence here on the French border. So moving troops into this part of Germany is then a total break with every kind of international agreement following the First World War. So it is a precocious situation. It is a gamble, as you say, because the German armed forces, they do not know how France, Great Britain, Italy, other European countries will react to this. It is a violation of the Versailles Treaty. In theory, France, Britain, Italy should now go to war with Germany. That is the stakes. And of course, this is a war that Nazi Germany will obviously lose. They have no ability to fight a war against France and Britain at the same time in 1936. So there is no real serious reaction from the major European powers. And this is also then quite representative of the international agenda in the interwar period, where there are very, very few that are actually interested in upholding these international agreements that were put in place after the First World War. And specifically, the leaders of both France and Great Britain want to do everything they can in order to avoid a new military confrontation with Germany and a repeat of the war from 1914 to 1918. That's absolutely what they want to avoid. So that's why they do not react to this German violation of the Versailles Treaty.
Hmm. So, how crucial is the Rhineland for rearmament? As we talked about it being it is of course an industrial area, so I imagine it very crucial. But just how crucial is it for the German rearmament?
The Rhineland itself is not crucial in rearmament. It's not heavily industrialized. The most industrialized regions of Germany, of course, is the Ruhr, that's
Yeah.
on the east bank of the Rhine, and parts of central Germany, like Silesia or Schlesien, which is the most heavily industrialized. So it's in economic terms, it's not important. But it is very important in the sense that Hitler is somewhat testing the waters. What
Yeah.
can we do without being or without receiving any threats or actual physical confrontation with the Western powers? Not many German soldiers crossed into the Rhineland. They could have been met by French armies there. They were, according to the Versailles Treaty, supposed to stop this militarization, but they chose not to do so. But had they done so, this would have been an extremely public defeat for Hitler and would have seriously damaged the Nazi government at home. Its prestige and its ability to retrace the Versailles Treaty with peaceful means, because we mentioned the economic improvements and the destruction of the unemployment as an important part why most Germans supported Hitler and supported the regime. And they also supported because they are removing the Versailles Treaty by peaceful means. They do it without fighting wars. They reintroduce conscription, there is no war. They militarize the Rhineland, there is no war. So that's the relief, you could say, for most Germans, that they support the destruction of the Versailles Treaty, but they do not want it to be leading to a war. That's what also Germans want to avoid at any cost. A repeat of the war from 1914 to 1918. So that they are able to do so peacefully makes Hitler extremely popular. But so should he fail in this, this would then reverse. So it's a gamble and it's a symbolic victory that makes Hitler and his closest associates thinking that we could go even further in our rearmament process. We do not have anything to fear from the Western allies in this specific case.
Hmm. Now, the next topic, of course, we mentioned this earlier, is the reunification, not reunification, but unification of non-German or of Germans not living in Germany, and that was a big part of Hitler's propaganda as well, that he wanted to reunite all German-speaking nations, all German-speaking people. For
Mm.
example, Austria. So let's talk about how Austria were inquired into the Third Reich and how the consequences, of course, for the Jewish population living in Austria, because ironically, as I think we mentioned before, the Jewish population in Germany was just a minority, and ironically, it would be when as Hitler acquired new land, there would be more and more Jews living in German territories. So the let's talk about how Hitler managed to acquire Austria again without causing World War II.
Mm. Yes, one of the leading ideas of the Nazi movement after it came to power, and of course also before it came to power, is the idea of Lebensraum or living
Yeah.
space. This is closely associated to this racial understanding of the world and the idea, which we often call social Darwinism, that it is natural for different nations, different races to be fighting and that war between nations is a natural thing, like it is like struggle within a pack of wolves or a pack of lions. The strongest wolf or the strongest lion is the one that decides. So Hitler and other Nazis think that this is also ideas or an understanding that should be governing humans as well, and of course also how nations should refer to each other. So war, expansion, militarization, rearmament, they are intrinsic parts of a Nazi worldview. They are very important parts of Nazism. So to talk about expansion, to occupy other parts, is a part of Nazism. So this is not something that is very prolific in the early parts of the regime, because also Hitler and the Nazis, they know that they are not able to do so in the first years, and they also realize that there is no real um, interest in going to war within the German population. They want to keep Germany peaceful and quiet because that's the safest and the best thing for them. So what they do instead is they talk about, as you say, German minorities and the need to reintegrate them into Germany. And this has much more resonance with the German people. And they talk about Germans in Poland, they talk about Germans in Austria, in the Czechoslovak Republic, and also Germans in France or in regions between Germany and France that are governed by the international community, like the Saarland region, where there is a plebiscite in 1935 where the inhabitants of Saarland that used to be German before the First World War then decide to reintegrate into the new Germany rather than to become a part of the Democratic Republic of France. So, but Hitler himself or leading Nazis, they're not really interested or concerned about German minorities in other countries, but they use them as a political tool in order to create an environment where a military confrontation is possible. Now, this is most specifically used towards Czechoslovakia in the autumn of 1938 and against Poland in 1939. The Austrian case is different because there's also strong elements within the Austrian community that want to integrate with Germany.
There is
The
also a
new,
Nazi party in Germany, and they tried the coup d'etat, but that failed, of course, earlier
yes,
that year. So there is a strong, but there is a strong Nazi party in Germany as well.
in Austria, you mean?
Oh, sorry, Austria. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there is. It causes a lot of problems to the Austrian government. So they are banned in 1932. So this is part of the. So Austria also has a right-wing government in some years before 1938 and the so-called Anschluss, this connection to or this occupation by Nazi Germany. So there are forces within Austria that want to integrate with Germany. So we can debate whether Austria was actually occupied by the Nazi Germany or was more like a willing annexation. But there are quite strong sentiments within Austrian society that want to integrate with Austria. So there are when the German soldiers you could say, invade or move into Austria in the I think it's March of 1938, they are greeted by huge crowds and are then seen as not as occupiers but more like liberators or people that are pursuing a policy that many Austrians, of course not all of them, actually agree on. So it's quite peaceful and uh, of course it's not peaceful because it leads to persecutions of communists and social democrats and Jewish population, particularly of the city of Vienna. But it's peaceful in the sense that it doesn't lead to a war. And the major powers of Europe, like the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, they view this as more like an internal German question that they should not interfere with. So they have no problem with accepting that Austria becomes part of Germany.
Mm. Now, wasn't there an election as well, and how free the election it was can be questionable. But there was, I believe, there was an election as well into voting to integrate into the German Reich as well. Which of course the majority voted yes, but how, like you said, how free it was can be questionable.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then, of course, the next target of Hitler and that this is a kind of a big one because he was hoping that this would lead to war because Hitler wanted war at this point, and he later said that he regretted not invading in 19, Czechoslovakia in 1938. But let's talk about how the northern part of Czechoslovakia would also be integrated into the Third Reich because it's also quite a
Yeah,
complicated process. And again,
absolutely.
Hitler wanted this to be the beginning of the war, of course, and he wouldn't get this. And this is where Chamberlain plays a big part, I think, of the negotiation process. So you have to kind of introduce Chamberlain as well to into the story here.
Yes. And I think this will have to be the final topic
Yeah,
of today because we are running out of time, Alan. So, but we
yeah,
can
of
we can
course.
briefly touch upon the Czechoslovak question before we move on to the war itself, maybe in a later episode. And you are quite right that we are now at the summer of 1938. The German rearmament process has been gaining pace. Of course, Hitler is also aware that this is causing huge problems to Germany, and this is not something that can actually go on forever without this having significant consequences. So he's thinking that we need a war now before this edge that we have now goes away, and that maybe the German economy will disintegrate completely before they are able to start a war. For a long time, Hitler and his close associates has been thinking that in order to create the possibility for German occupation of parts of Europe, they have to first get control of Austria and then Czechoslovakia, or at least in the western parts of Czechoslovakia. That has been a founding of the German strategy since the 1933, more or less. Um, In this case, Hitler and the Nazis uses the German minority that lives in the western parts of Czechoslovakia, in the Sudetenland, the so-called Sudet Germans. There are about 2 to 3 million German-speaking people living in the state of Czechoslovakia. This is, of course, then made after the First World War, and there's a huge German minority there. So they try to create this image of that this minority is maltreated by the Czechoslovak
Yeah.
government, and that the German armed forces have to move in to protect this threatened minority. This is an old trick. And it has, of course, been used by other
Putin, for
uh,
example, in Ukraine's invasion.
Absolutely. This is a favorite ploy, you could say, by dictators. So Hitler doesn't care anything of the Sudeten Germans. He doesn't care at all. But he thinks that they could be used as this tool to open military confrontation with the Czechoslovak state. Of course, Czechoslovakia is a small Central European country. It is very industrialized. It has a very strong army and also or a very modern army compared to its size, and strong fortifications along the Czech-German border. Significantly, it's also allied to France. So any attack on Czechoslovakia would also then, at least in theory, force France to respond. So a German attack on Czechoslovakia would take quite a lot of time because of the small but modern Czechoslovak army, and it would, in theory at least, create a war with France, and then perhaps also France ally Great Britain. So this is something that Germany cannot afford in 1938. They cannot afford a war on two fronts, but they are thinking that the wish to keep Europe peaceful, at least in the sense avoid a major confrontation between the large countries of Europe, then contain the Czechoslovak question to only this region. That is the way to keep or avoid a major war. So both France and Britain, through Prime Minister Chamberlain, are then ready to give in to Hitler's demands that the German minority in the western parts of Czechoslovakia should have increased rights or more or less independence from the Czechoslovak state. So, because this is what Hitler talks about. He talks about increased independence for the German minority in Czechoslovakia. But he doesn't care about that. Because he knows that this is not something that the Czechoslovak government will actually agree on, and then he can force them to go to war. So in the Munich conference in September 1938, this is the issue that is being discussed. So Hitler has then more or less laid forth a demand that he doesn't want. And the British and French governments, particularly Prime Minister Chamberlain, they actually oblige Hitler's demand, the demand that he doesn't want. So at the time, this is seen as a huge victory for the Western powers because they have again avoided war with Germany. They have only then had to give him parts of Czechoslovakia, which nobody actually cares about. So they are sacrificing, you could say, the Czechoslovak Republic in order to satisfy what Hitler says that he wants.
And of course,
Of
this is the
course, he
famous
wants,
Chamberlain quote where he said, "Peace in our time," when he returned
yeah,
back
yeah. So
to Britain.
yes, so today this is ridiculed and is seen as democratic republics bowing to the totalitarian dictator. But at the time Chamberlain was celebrated, this was seen as a major coup for creating the foundations for a lasting peace. And Hitler was furious. Hitler did not receive what he wanted, the possibility to go to war with Czechoslovakia in the autumn of 1938. That's what he
Uh,
wanted.
I'm sorry
And of
for
course,
going a little
yeah,
bit off topic here, but are we making the same mistakes with Ukraine as Chamberlain did in with Czechoslovakia in today's world, or have we learned from Chamberlain's mistakes So I'm not trying to sure how to say his name. I read it right in my head many times as saying his name, so sorry if I get it wrong, but are we making the same mistake Chamberlain did with Ukraine today in 2025 and 20 from 2022 to 2026? Or do you feel we
Mm.
have learned from the mistakes of 1938?
I'm not sure that we have learned from the mistakes because politicians or leaders today they don't think about 1938 when they make a decisions what to do in
Mm,
Ukraine or to do with Russia. They are thinking about the situation today. How can we best solve the issues that are now? They're not looking back to what happened
mm.
like 70, 80, 90 years
It's
ago.
quite still
So
relevant though, so they should.
yes, it is well, but we have to. There are also two different contexts here, so we cannot compare them completely.
Yeah,
But it did create a lot of traction when Russian representatives were at the security conference in Munich, and talking about their specific needs. So there was like a second Munich,
yeah,
you could say. And then and Munich has a lot of bad reputation in international
yeah.
relations, of course. In the end, you could say that Chamberlain did something wrong, that he miscalculated. Had there been war in the autumn of 1938, Germany would have lost, and the Second World War would have ended in 6 months. So you could say that that would have been a better outcome. But again, Chamberlain was a prime minister in a democracy, and so was the prime minister and president of France. No French people, no English people, or British people wanted war. They wanted peace almost at any cost. And that was also what Chamberlain delivered. So, if we look at the context of the autumn of 1938, the policies of Chamberlain were very, very well received. He
Mm,
was one of the major superstars of the international community in 1938. So, in the end, it turned out to be the wrong
mm,
decision. And but at the time, it appeared as maybe the right thing to do. It was a miscalculation, you could
mm,
say, of the radical will of Hitler and the Nazi government to actually force a war quite later, and also to violate the agreement that they agreed upon in Munich, because it didn't take long before Nazi Germany broke this treaty.
mm. And
Yeah, so I think.
Yeah, yeah, we
I
don't.
think this has to be the final word for today because
Yeah,
we have
of course. I think
I
it was a two and a
have
half
to move on
hours
to other
almost.
things.
Yeah, of
Sorry?
course. But before you go, of course, where can people find you again? Of course, if you have anything you want to share and in this description, anything else you're working on, anything you want to add links you wanted to share, where can people find you? If they have further questions about what we talked about today, where can people find you? And again, the same old rules. I'm going to try to run it very quickly. Now is the time to share if you want any links in the description on the website, etc. If you have anything to share.
Yes, I think people will find me and my email address if they want to ask any questions. So I'm happy to answer them, or they could add a comment below the video or the podcast. And if we have some time, we could look into them and perhaps discuss and answer them.
This has been with that, Ishmael. Thank you again so much for coming. I really enjoyed this conversation. It took a little bit longer than I expected, but here we are at the end of next week. We will take a look at the start and well, the Third Reich at war. And of course, this has been with that aged well. My name is Alan. We are available on social media on with that aged well on Instagram, and sorry, not Spotify, but Instagram and Twitter. And under with that H12, you can find us and with the same name, with that H12 on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts these days. I'm gonna cut this short because again, I don't want to waste your time too much. But of course, like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, and all of that. And I'll see you next time.